Arbiter Vildred was recently buffed in 2 separate ways, which opens up a very meaningful and much stronger way to use him than previously before. To be clear though, this new playstyle isn't technically new to Arby, but these new changes specifically are now much more interesting in modern epicseven for Arby's viability. With this though, instead of only being used for AoE damage, there's now a viable evasion-based riposte playstyle that's now growing in popularity. So today we'll be breaking down exactly what's been buffed from his kit, what the special equipment actually changes, and why this build makes sense. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. To start things off, Arbiter Vildred still revolves around his AoE damage, his reset potential, his revive, but now with the new special equipment and buffs, he does gain additional survivability and dueling value that lets him stay on field longer. Now, this does kind of shift him away from the die once and do damage playstyle, and now kind of shifts him more towards prolonged and kind of evasive either anti-cleave or longer term fights. To explain why he's so strong though, let's explain or go through his kit, starting with his skill 1. Now, this is something that has changed, and now with it, Arby attacks 2 enemies and now newly transfers 2 debuffs from himself while doing so, and since this transfer ignores effect resistance on crit, this is very powerful, though it does force you into building crit, but that's not really a downside if you're basically building him normal. However, I do want to say that with this is pretty huge with riposte, since now every counterattack is effectively a high chance of being a self-cleanse and disruption towards the enemy team, which is super valuable. Now we have his skill 2, and new from this though, from his old kit, is that when his focus is full at the start of turn, the Dark Blade buff resets automatically, and on death, Arby will still revive to full HP, gain the CR as before, and also max out his focus. Pretty useful, and again, this is very helpful for guaranteeing or doing lots of damage. Now for his skill 3, this skill 3 damage was buffed, and Arby now gives himself attack increase before basically damaging all enemies, but while this has been changed, this still applies decreased hit chance and gains bonus damage with full focus and resets on kill as you'd expect. Now, on that note though, it is also worth mentioning that combined with the S2 changes, Arby now cycles through his S3 much more reliably and can actually get there without dying as often. Now, we should actually talk about the exclusive equipment because this is basically what has enabled all of the changes to Arby. Now, this was already available on Arbiter Vildred in the past, but this was changed now to both activate at the start of battle and after revive, and this of course gives Arbiter Vildred 70 evasion, which is increased, I believe, from what it was before, and now this has newly introduced bonus damage against light units, which is pretty insane, and does maybe use or kind of suggest that he could be used against character like Genesis Raz, or maybe some of the other light squishy units. We'll have to wait and see though. Now, as for the build that you're seeing here, there are a few kind of caveats to it. Something that you'll probably notice here is that this is riposte and the fact that I have immunity. Now, personally, with immunity, I find that this is super important because characters like Raz or other characters like Perfumer Biblis can shut down a character like Arbiter Vildred pretty easily if they're controlled. And in this case, being able to at least have immunity from this is pretty nice so that he can't just get raw S2'd by Genesis Raz or, again, provoked and permanently crowd controlled by, again, any debuffer, though the debuffer doesn't necessarily have to have a strip in their kit. Now, on that note, riposte is pretty strong, obviously, I'd say, because after successfully evading, you have a 70% chance to counterattack. And with this, though it's not necessarily guaranteed, if you combine the evasion here of 70% and you either pair this character with like Setsuka, or if you end up using something like Lethal Whispers or any of the evasion artifacts on Arbiter Vildred, this ends up being an additive 90% evasion, which is pretty huge, pretty nice. And overall, I think that the set, whether you choose to run this character on riposte or something else, is fine. But I think riposte probably fits best just because he has so much innate evasion already. This is kind of like a no-brainer. Now, in terms of stats, you'll see mine are okay. I have 4.3k attack. I've got 13,000 HP, 300 crit damage. But in terms of what you're actually looking for builds for Arbiter Vildred, is you're looking for high attack, high crit damage, no speed, and more importantly, definitely an exclusion of speed, as you don't want to lose out on your immunity or you don't want to lose your buff as much. You would preferably, honestly, take as few turns as possible so you can keep your debuffs for longer, or rather your own personal buffs for longer. But in addition to this, again, the goal is basically to just have bulk. Now, what this looks like, therefore, is about 4,000 attack, 300 crit damage, which is what you're seeing here. And his speed should be pretty low, likely in the sub 150 range, though his bulk can again range between 13,000 to 15,000 HP, or alternatively, you could swap out something like an attack ring for an HP ring, and sit closer to maybe something closer to 20,000 HP, and drop his attack by about 300 to 500. 500, that is, like, total, so about like 3,500 attack, just for for clarity's sake. Anyways, you're also building him, of course, to stay alive long enough for evasion and riposte to matter, so you do care about his bulkiness. But let's actually talk about his artifacts, because you do have a few options here. The best option here, I would say, is probably going to be something like Lethal Whispers. Again, this reads that after counterattacking, when the ally, or rather when the target is still alive, you have a 40% chance to activate a basic skill once more. This kind of makes a huge amount of sense with, your ability and how much countering you're already doing with Arby's S1 and how valuable it is. But again, this by itself already putting you at 90 evasion is pretty nice. However, we do have additional options. The alternatives here, in my opinion, would of course be something like Moonlight Dreamblade, which does give you a self-attack increase for your counters, which is actually something pretty relevant, as otherwise you'd have to S3 first if you would even want this attack increase. But otherwise, you could also have something like, again, something like the Proof of Valor, or you can even have something like Shepherd. A lot of these artifacts are pretty fine, as they give evasion in general, or again, even something like the Hall of Trials, evasion artifact is also cool, but I would probably say if you don't have something like Lethal Whispers, having access to, I believe it should be here around, here it is, having something like Double-Edged Decrescent, or Decrescent is pretty cool. I would say in general, though, this is likely going to be more consistent counter-wise than some of your other options, but something similar, or for me this feels kind of similar to the what sort of artifact should you run on Fire Kayron, or what should you have ran in the past, where it feels more like you just need to pick what you have access to or what you have maxed, as again there are probably a couple characters at this point that may swap or kind of need changing, and depending on what you have build wise, you can go through and adjust and change your artifact as you see fit. Now, of course, why this build works more specifically is obviously because if they hit, you still have the ability to revive. If they miss, you have riposte, and this counters and punishes them. And if they ignore, well, this is still a decent amount of damage that you kind of can't ignore with S3, or even things like dual attacking with S1. So in general, I'd say he's pretty annoying to deal with. And again, even if we take a moment, I'd actually like to highlight a certain scene, if I can open this up, where I actually had oh, not this one, excuse me. Ooh. Okay, I actually had a scene here where you can see basically the Genesis Raz, or the Genesis Raz, who I think is likely going to be the character that most people is likely going to be the person that a lot of people end up picking Arbiter Vildred into, kind of doesn't have anything that you can do here. As you're seeing on screen, you kind of have him push up, and despite, again, having superhuman and this kind of being like maybe one of the most insane damage dealing sources in the game when they're buffed, this doesn't quite do too much, because again, when you S3 here, you can see you effectively miss, you get countered back. And again, even if you were to do something like an S2 here, or if you were to S2 with someone like Genesis Raz here, he's got the immunity here. Sorry for the quality, of course. But he does do a decent amount of damage here. This is 12,000 damage. And the Arbiter Vildred, again, though not insanely tanky, has a bit of health, and he does avoid this, which if he can continue to do so, that's about 2 to 3 possible clapbacks or hits, and this could be something close to, again, like 24,000 HP worth of damage, which is pretty significant in my opinion. Now, beyond this, I'd also like to showcase a bit of the other B-roll, which is just for Arena in general. Oop. And again, while I think this is pretty fine in general, I don't think that Arbiter Vildred is necessarily a character that is restricted to one sort of playstyle. As you're seeing right now, the sort of Arbiter Vildred that I have fits best in things like bruiser teams, turn 2 drafts, or sustain heavy compositions. The strong partners that you have here can include, of course, Performant Biblis, Setsuka for 100% evasion, or even Estelle if you're trying to avoid taking damage. These units, though, in general, they, of course, help extend fights, they provide utility or protection, and in general, they give Arby the ability to abuse evasion and obviously riposte more and more over time. Now, with this, though, if you choose to play this playstyle, of course, the goal isn't necessarily to instantly win here. Of course, some people may give up after they see how kind of, like, pointless this is, but this is really not the same sort of I'm going to give up because, like, Arbiter Vildred has S3'd and one-shot everything on my team. It's kind of just he's whittling you down, and even if you try to continue, like, pressuring him, he's got a decent amount of damage in his kit. He's got a lot of evasion, which is kind of, again, something that you will see characters like Setsuka take the slot of, which is, like, this really annoying, like, either debuffer or can't kill target that does still deal decent damage if you let them trigger or activate their conditionals. Now, I do also want to say or bring up the topic of whether or not you should use him, as again, I've kind of talked about how this really isn't classic RB cleave anymore, and I mean, it's true. This is a new evasion, riposte type style that's kind of incentivized through his EE, but if you're curious, I kind of went through the different sort of like thinkings perhaps for the different sort of players. If you're more of a turn one or cleave player, this is possible if you are trying, or rather I should say Arbiter Vildred is a decent pick if you're someone that's using them either as an early anchor or as a last pick. You may in some cases have your original draft banned out, or you may be struggling with what you can play around, and in that case I think it's probably fine to use something like Arbiter Vildred if you need to as a force ban or as a way to counter basically your counter. He seems to be okay. I think if you're a turn 2 or aggressive player, this is probably also a solid option for, again, dealing with some of the cleave options in the game. And otherwise, obviously, if you have Arby to begin with, I think it's definitely fine or ideal, I'd say, to even just test him to actually see how good or how bad he is in general. Overall, though, I found Arby's new evasion playstyle to basically turn him into a very strong aggro turn 2 character that's surprisingly hard to kill and actually quite annoying to deal with over time. That said, though, guys, that's basically all I have on Arby. I did and have spent quite a bit amount of time trying to make this character work in general, as for a little while I was missing a few of the MLs, like ML Iseria, not Briar, the Monarch Iseria, as like a counter option. So I was going through it, I was messing around with a different set of possible options. Arbiter Vildred, especially post-buff, I think is going to be one of these options that you will probably reach for. Kind of similar to like that Sage Ball or something like that Setsuka if you feel like you need more evasion on the team. But honestly though, guys, it's just nice seeing Arbiter Vildred back in the spotlight. And so that's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.